Bien le bonjour! This is more or less a test idea for a series of videos covering how the original English Disney songs were localized in France. Keep in mind that I'm not some kind of professional translator, linguist, or historian, so it's largely possible that references might fly over my head, especially for the oldest songs and their context, or that some of them are open to personal interpretations. Now, a bit more about how this will go down. I'll try to proceed by comparing either one line or group of lines, depending on a bunch of reasons, by letting the English plays out first, followed directly by the French one. I'll also give a translation of the French lyrics so you can understand what's going on. I decided to start with I've Got No Strings from the 1940s Disney's classic animated movie Pinocchio because it's a somewhat short song, and I think that most of you will directly jump to one part that I'll add in the description and or the pinned comment. Also, no Ultron will be involved in this. To begin with, just the French title of the song encapsulates an interesting subtlety. Sans aucun lien translates in English to without any restraint in this context. While strings are more or less seen as neutral, a restraint implies some force or lack of freedom, which is a recurring theme throughout the French version and seems to be somewhat brushed over in the original, simply with the use of that word lien instead of the direct translation fil or ficelle. The original mentions the idea that the strings on Pinocchio are, in fact, restraining his moves, even making him a slave to whoever has their hands on them. Compared to the French version, there are already a bunch of differences. With only this line, and again thanks to the use of the word bond or restraint instead of simple strings, they managed to convey the lack of freedom Pinocchio has been subjected to, that was conveyed in 4 lines in English. I'll try to not linger too much on the restraint bond part, you get the idea. What's left of the next 3 lines in French then? In French, Pinocchio talks about how he doesn't need any help to go around, which is funny when you think about him fumbling down the stairs right before. This idea is conveyed again in the following French lines, I'll get back to it.
I hit strings, but now I'm free. There are no strings on me. Je n'ai besoin d'aucune main qui tire des ficelles.
Pinocchio talks again about a before and after being freed from the strings, and ends up repeating that he isn't a prisoner or even a slave to the strings anymore. However, the French version doesn't focus on this matter and keeps on covering the idea that Pinocchio is a big boy able to stand for himself with those lyrics. Notice that this is the only time the word ficelle is used in the whole French localization instead of the recurring bonds or restraints, but it's probably to rhyme with the previous chancel.
Hi ho, the merry-o, that's the only way to be. I want the world to know, nothing ever worries me. Hi ho, depuis toujours, j'ai envie de faire la fête.
There's a difference of viewpoints here. In English, Pinocchio is quite bold and says that being merry is the only way to be, as if there is no arguing to this and that the whole world might try but nothing will change his mind, although I might be off the mark here with the use of nothing worrying him. However, in French, he's more talking about how he personally feels, without really saying that's the only way, period. That last line somewhat insists that being sad isn't a smart way of spending one's time, and that we should be celebrating the happy moments instead. But it's not entirely dismissing that bad things never happen, or that you must never think about them.
I got no strings, so I ain't
But I told you,
In the original, Pinocchio talks about how happiness, at least his own, is achieved thanks to having no strings attached, both physically and metaphorically. The French one is more about freedom in general, being able to go anywhere anytime without anyone's help, but there is no direct reference to happiness. And again we're back to lien instead of fil or ficelle.
They got aussi.
In English, Pinocchio compares himself to others, which is heavily hinted at other puppets in general needing someone to move them and give them life. The French version doesn't even acknowledge other puppets, just that Pinocchio can do things on his own with a strong undertone of past slavery because of the use of being emancipated. Before starting this next part, just so you know, the original version has a lot of harmless stereotypes going on, both in the broken English and in other cultural misconceptions, probably due to the year being 1940. The French version still use thick accents, but they all talk proper French and are less bold in what they're saying to Pinocchio.
You have no strings, your arms is free to love me by the side of thee. Vous êtes libre, vous pouvez m'aimer au pas tout de suite, c'est.
Yes, your arms is free is part of the stereotypes I warned you about. However, both versions are almost copy-pasted from one another, although the way to talk about Pinocchio's freedom is slightly different, with the English directly referring to the lack of strings on Pinocchio, while in French they just mention his freedom. The next lines about loving by the Zuiderzee are the same despite the added doors. Aux portes de, des, du in French just means next to or close to.
Yeah, 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 if you would do, I'd boost my strings for you. Yo, 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 je voudrais bien pour vous briser mes liens.
I don't know why they changed ya 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 to yo yo yo. Probably an artistic choice. Anyway, for the second part of this line, I looked it up because I really wasn't sure about what to woo means, and from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it simply means to court a woman, at least in this context. So she's saying that if Pinocchio tries to flirt with her, she'd be ready to follow him, going as far as using force to get out of her bonds. The French version has some differences in that Pinocchio doesn't even have to try. She has already fallen for him, but apparently she can't get rid of the restraints despite her willingness to do so. I'll get back to that part about busting at the end. Here's the part you were probably waiting for or directly skipped to.
You got no stains, Cousy-Cousin.
Okay, right here I need to address something. Cousy-Cousin is simply French for so-so when describing one's health, as in how are you feeling today? So-so. So Cousy-Cousin is complete bullshit here. But it sounds French, so it's okay? Sorry. You have no strings might also refer to Pinocchio not being engaged to another woman, on top of the obvious lack of physical strings.
Your savoir-faire is oh la la.
Yeah, of course it will boil down to this. Americans saw the French back then as really sex-craved people, or at least a lot more open about it. It's shown here with the French can-can puppet openly praising Pinocchio's performances in bed. Savoir-faire means know-how, but oh la la is used for two reasons in French. Either for something bad, like receiving bad news or being in shock at something like witnessing a train wreck, or to convey something naughty, akin to the infamous George Takei's "Oh my!" And in this context, it's pretty clear it's the latter. Yeah, you know, for kids!
Vous êtes libre pour l'amour. Vous devriez me faire la cour.
The French localization made things a lot less aggressive and more subtle, with the puppet asking first if Pinocchio is single, although love can have a romantic meaning, or the sexual intercourse one, making love. But I'm probably reaching there. And the next line is a follow-up only if Pinocchio is single and willing to put up with courtship even if the tone is rather pressing.
I've got stings, but entre nous, I'd cut my stings for you. J'ai des liens, mais entre nous, je les briserai pour vous.
It's almost word for word the same lines in both versions, saying that she's ready to quit everything for Pinocchio. Not counting the restraints change again, she doesn't talk about cutting the strings in French, but about breaking them, implying brute force instead of using another tool. It might just be an artistic choice to keep some sort of consistency with the previous Dutch puppet also wanting to break them, But I don't know, to be honest, because using Je les couperai pour vous would have worked all the same. There's an interesting nuance to breaking or busting as opposed to cutting that ended up missing in French.
Don't burn the world go flows, there's a Russian rum there.
Au bord de la Volga, j'ai une revissantise bas.
I didn't find an explanation to what exactly a Russian rendezvous is. But if you take into account the two previous puppets, it might again refer to courtship or something naughtier. However, the French version doesn't refer to something like this in those lines. Remind me who is obsessed with lovemaking again? Just kidding. Anyway, in French, she talks about a more physical place, an izba, but is more vague about the Volga, and there is nothing really clear about the relevancy of this house outside of sounding really Russian and rhyming with Volga.
Bear me and I wouldn't go, but I'd rather go with you. Hey!
J'y vais avec Ivan, et j'aimerais mieux avec toi. Hi!
There's no difference outside of some minor rearrangements of words that might just be my fault in trying to retranslate again from French. So I'm gonna cover something different in the Russian puppets lines compared to the two previous ones. The Dutch and French puppets talk about strings and how they'd get rid of them if Pinocchio wanted them to, while the Russian one doesn't acknowledge those directly. However, she is the only one mentioning another man by name, Ivan, whom she is supposed to go with somewhere for whatever reason. It might be just another Russian stereotype insertion, but it also conveys the idea that she has metaphorical strings, restraints or bonds with this man. Maybe her fiancé or husband? We went from strings as in they're puppets yet Pinocchio doesn't need any, to adultery? I'm probably reading too much into this, so I'll let you decide.
There are no strings on me. Je suis un affranchi.
And we end here again with a slavery depiction in French instead of a more direct approach of strings in the original. In conclusion, both versions try to convey some interesting ideas, although not entirely the same. I would have loved to do a proper and longer conclusion, but I think it's better to stop here for a first try at this project. Do not hesitate to give a piece of your mind in the comments or even suggest the next song. And if you like that, well, give a like, it's just one more click. I'm trying to focus on the shorter songs first, and as you can see, there's already a lot to say. Merci beaucoup, prenez soin de vous et amusez-vous bien, au revoir.